It's Professor Grodman, and this is a discussion on memory which pertains to chapter 6 in our textbook. Um, there are many different types of memory. Let's start with three specifically. Sensory memory is literally a split second memory, the processing of any of the five senses, a sight, a sound, smell. And it's a very fleeting memory. It doesn't maintain. It's not encoded. It does not become part of any extended any. It doesn't extend beyond that second. Then there is something called short term, also referred to as working memory. And different textbooks have different definitions of this. We're going to go with what's sometimes referred to as very short term memory, 2 to 30 seconds. And this, a telephone number, someone's name, a fleeting thought, these are examples of short term memory. And there is a process in which memory gets transferred into a more extended memory called long term memory. And essentially, it involves the transfer of information from short term to long term memory. One of the ways that we put memory into long term memory is by grouping it together. So if you have a telephone number, 857 7295, that's my NCC telephone number. Rather than seven digits, you put together 857 7295. It reduces the number. This is referred to as chunking. And it makes short-term memory easier, but also helps and facilitates the transfer of information from short-term memory to long-term. Now, with regard to that construct or that transfer of information from short-term to long-term memory, there are different ways of doing it. One way is referred to as maintenance rehearsal, and that is just essentially rote repetition, saying something over and over again. That is usually not an efficient or particularly effective method. It's doable. You memorize a poem or something of that sort. But usually it's easier to learn by association, by making connections, by making meaningful, associations, connecting new information with previously learned information, maybe a hobby or an interest. Why is it so much easier to learn about something you find meaningful? Well, because you can make these associations and it's intrinsically interesting. All this ties in to something called, again, elaborative rehearsal. Or elaborative rehearsal is a more effective and efficient way of transferring information from short-term to long-term memory. And we're going to continue on talking about different memory constructs. There is something called recognition memory. That involves cues. A multiple choice test would be a prime example of this. You also have memory that really does not involve cues or very few cues, more of what's referred to as recall memory. So if I ask you to tell me everything you would tell me about memory, sensory, short-term, long-term, maintenance rehearsal, elaborative rehearsal, I'm giving you all sorts of cues. That's recognition memory. Versus tell me everything you know about psychology or memory. That's really without cues. That's recall memory. There's also a phenomenon with memory that is when we learn something, when we are initially transferring that information from short term to long term, encoding it, putting it into long term memory or storage. We do it if we we do it in a certain place, physical place, like a classroom. It's actually easier to retrieve that information in that same place. Or if you're calm when you remember a certain mood state, when you learn something, you're likely to retrieve it more when you are in that same state. There are two names that really sort of are they're terms that speak to this, and the terms are state-dependent learning, also referred to as encoding specificity. Encoding specificity. At this point in the lecture, I'll often have I'll say some numbers. For example, how about this at home? In the privacy of your own phone or however you're getting this, say these numbers: 714 7551. and now you would say it back to me. Which numbers are most memorable? Probably the first number, and that is referred to as the law of primacy, that we tend to remember first better. And that pertains both to short-term memory as well as long-term memory. Those same numbers, you might find yourself remembering the last digit better. And the name for this, which applies both to short and long-term memory, is referred to as the law of recency. I also gave you, actually, let's do it again. I want to illustrate one other thing. I'm going to say some numbers again, and when I'm through, try to repeat them after me. 8397214 A little more difficult because there are 8 digits. There is something about 7 digits which makes it easier. This is actually referred to as the magic 7. The magic 7. The man or the person associated with this concept is named George Miller. Additionally, with regard to memory, and we said before about long-term memory, there is another really interesting phenomenon, and I'm writing it down as we speak because some of these terms are actually in long-term memory, and they're getting triggered somehow, and I did not have them down on my notes. And it's a term referred to as the method of savings. The person associated with it, his name is Hermann Ebbinghaus, Ebbinghaus. There are a few things that I did not put on your outline because I'm just sort of adding a few now. But anyway, just take the note. Just make note of these. And Ebbinghaus, probably around 100 years ago or so, he did an experiment with memory that was quite intriguing, and that is he taught his young children fake words or nonsense words, and they encoded them. They were put into long-term memory. Now, one of the things that happens, and we'll get into this in just a bit, is if you don't use your long-term memory, you do lose that or some of it. And so what he was curious about was, would there be a difference if you introduce those same words again, maybe like a year later? And he did it, and then reintroduced new nonsense words the kids had not been exposed to. And the old ones that they had forgotten and memory had decayed were learned more quickly than the new ones, although they were of comparable difficulty. And again, this is referred to as the method of savings. The question I normally ask class at this point is also, how many days do you remember of school? How many days with specificity, clarity? And the answer is typically not that many. And this seems to be consistent with memory, that we remember select information, and we tend to remember things that are dramatic. Not traumatic, but with a D, dramatic. And there's a name for this. If you have a very clear memory of an event or sort of circumstances, it's called a flashbulb memory, like a flashbulb camera in the old days. And most memories don't work this way. When you think about, do you remember a time or place where you remember what verbiage was used, what people said, all that. And there were usually just a handful of these sorts of experiences. And these are flashbulb memories. Memories are also influenced by emotions. Sometimes very painful emotions can actually reduce memory. So if it's really painful, Freud talked about this, we may repress a memory, that we unconsciously block it out. There may be some biological processes working here as well, based on from a contemporary prism. It's viewed a bit more neurobiological, but nonetheless, if you want to refer to it in a psychological sense and harken back to Freud's day, that's called a repressed memory. You just don't even remember it, nor do you remember blocking it out. Some memories, though, are painful, and we do remember them but don't want to think about them. We sort of push them to the side, compartmentalize them. And these are referred to as suppressed, with an S, suppressed memories. The accuracy of memory is often very questionable. They're highly subjective, influenced by lots of things. For example, if you go on a trip and you have a pretty good time, but your luggage was lost and you had a couple of days of bad weather, and someone asks you right after you get back from Florida, wherever you came from, how was it? You say it was pretty good, except, well, a year later you may not be saying that. And there's a reason for that, and that is people start to talk about the experience, or you start to talk about the experience of the trip with others, and you start finding yourself oftentimes reconstructing the memory. Actually, they don't call this reconstructive processing; they call it constructive processing. But it has to do essentially with sort of a reconstruct of the memories. So again, memories tend to be, like most things, subjective and subject to bias. And although long-term memory, I don't know if I said this, but it's an important point. Long-term memory has the capacity to be limitless and for a lifetime. There are things that you'll remember. I don't know, a telephone number from early childhood, or I don't know, an event that occurred, or your old house that you lived in until you were 6. These are long-term memories that you may live and remember till you're 100 years old. There are things we forget, a lot of things we forget, and there are reasons why we forget, and we'll go through 4 of them. One reason you forget is a lack of use. You just don't, if you've ever taken, I don't know, algebra or something like that, many people just, you took it, you had it, but you don't remember it. That's a lack of use. Now, the next time around when you're exposed to it, you may remember it more quickly. That's the method of savings. But a lot of people just forget because of a lack of use. Also, you don't have many algebraic cues available to you unless you're doing work that would tie into that. So that's another reason, although very similar to the use rather. It is independent. It's a second reason why we forget: lack of cues. A third of the 4 reasons is something called interference. Interference has to do with overlapping memories. Friends you knew years ago, you start to forget their names because many other people you've known many other people since with the same name or the same behavioral or physical characteristics. Now, there are people who you'll never forget because they're so unique, there is no overlap. That's part of a flashbulb memory. There's just not that interference. So it's a once-in-a-lifetime sort of thing. There are also 2 types of interference, something called proactive interference and retroactive. Let's start with proactive interference. Now, interference occurs with like or similar memories. So let's look at it from an academic perspective. And if you take sociology and psychology, you're more likely to have interference than you would if you took physics and French. Now, it's also true that if you take like courses, they tend to overlap in a way that reinforces the memory. There's a lot of transfer of memory, which is good, but they can also result in some decay or interference and ultimately some decay of memory. So proactive interference, an example would be sociology and psychology are pretty similar. So you take sociology 2 years ago, and it starts to interfere with your ability to remember psych today. The name for that is proactive interference, like projecting into the future. The more likely and more typical form or type of interference is called retroactive interference. The psych you take today starts to affect the soc you took last year. Think about it. If you meet 100 people this year, it might be a little tougher to meet them this year, but I'm sure you can online and elsewhere, and maybe even in person. But those people, if you're doing something in life that's highly interpersonal, the more people you meet, the more likely your earlier memories, a year, 2, 5, 10 years ago, get eroded or decayed because the same name, the same type of person, the same experience are similar. This is referred to as retroactive interference. So events in 2020 start to erode and decay similar events in 2015 or 18 or 19. Finally, there are neurobiological reasons why we forget. Loss of memory to dementia. There are many different types of dementia. Alzheimer's being the most common, but there are other neurobiological changes. It could be an injury to the brain due to an accident, a car accident, or some other injury, stroke to the brain. So there are a number of neurobiological factors. So just to review, we talked about sensory memory for a split second, short term, also referred to as working memory. The transfer of information from short to long term is learning. Long term is essentially unlimited. Putting items into groups to remember them more quickly, that's called chunking. When we transfer information from short term to long term, we can do it through rote repetition or maintenance rehearsal, but it usually is more effective if we do it by associations. We make connections, connect new information with previously learned information. This is elaborative rehearsal. Usually easier to remember things with recognition memory, cues, than not having cues, recall memory. Your kindergarten class, you have a picture of your classmates, you're more likely to remember names than not having that picture because you're involving cues or recognition memory. If you learn something in a certain state, you're more likely to remember it better in that same state. This is state-dependent learning, also referred to as encoding specificity. Both with regard to short-term memory and long-term memory, we remember first better, typically law of primacy, last, law of recency. Remember your first day of school as a kid? Law of primacy. Your last day of high school? Law of recency. The second time we learn something, even if there is some decay to it, we learn it more quickly, the method of savings. And we remember about 7 digits in auditory memory, short-term memory. Also, we tend to remember things that are dramatic. We might even have very clear, vivid memories of something, a flashbulb memory. But emotions can be a diminishing of memory. If something is very painful, you may block it out unconsciously, a repressed memory, or consciously block it out. This is referred to as a suppressed memory. We also tend to reconstruct memories over time. This is referred to as constructive processing. And we do forget. We do forget because of a lack of use, lack of cues, overlapping memories called interference. And again, there were 2 types of interference. When an earlier event affects a more current and related event, proactive interference. And when a present event affects an earlier but related event or stimulus, that's retroactive interference. Finally, there are neurobiological reasons as to why we forget, things like dementia or Alzheimer's. Okay, so that marks the end of this discussion of Chapter 6 and memory.